Here is Juan Luis Suarez, and he will talk about sustaining a global community, art and religion in the network of Baroque Hispanic American paintings. And he's one of the few people who talk about networks in art history, but he's a philosopher, which is awesome.
Well, thank you for the presentation, and thank you all for being here. I'm talking on behalf of my colleagues, Fernando Sancho and Javier de la Rosa, who are in the audience, and we'll be happy to answer also any questions that you might have. The agenda for today is to say something about the Cultureplex Lab at the University of Western Ontario. We'll pose the three main research questions we have for the data we have. What's the source of our data, the methodology, and some preliminary results and discussion. In the Cultureplex laboratory, we mainly work with something we call cultural complexity, which is something we try to describe through several projects. The main one is a 7-year project on the Hispanic Baroque, in which there are 35 researchers from 7 or 8 disciplines working on different aspects of how Baroque culture spread from Europe to Latin America over a 3-century period, and how it was adopted, the change in different places and locations in America. So we are interested in all phases of cultural dynamics in the creation of a cultural product or a cultural artifact, a work of art. Also in the transmission, I think that's one of the main missing issues in the work of humanists, that we normally work with 1, 2, 3, all the works of a single artist, but we really need to understand how culture is transmitted. And also in the representation. That's why we put a lot of emphasis on the semantics of the objects we work on, and as we will see later on. The main issues we have with cultural complexity is that we need to analyze the data and information we have at multiple scales because of the 3 issues that I mentioned before. We need a multidisciplinary approach. I study philosophy, but we need people from architecture, art history, linguistics, of course mathematics and computer science. And also we try to create our technologies when we can, and develop new methodologies that can be applied by humanists in different aspects. For instance, we're working now on the creation of multimedia packages for contemporary arts curators with the Queen Sofia Museum in Madrid. Motivations behind our work has to do with the collection and storage of rich information with semantic content. Otherwise, most humanists don't want to deal with all the data and they don't understand what we are doing. And I think that there is a fair point there. But we also need to use robust abstract representation models. That's why philosophers and mathematicians are talking to each other in our lab. Of course, the visualization analysis tools, especially, or if possible, made understandable for humanists who are posing the research questions in many cases. And we also try to publish and share information in simple and rich ways. Common properties of all the data and subsystems that we are working on is that we always keep an interest in the topics and also in the relationships between them. We try to create flexible representation schema at several levels: descriptions, semantics, and relational. And we try to found everything on a robust mathematical principles and network theory or data mining. What are the main questions we have for the data we present today? First has to do with cultural transmission, work being done in cognitive psychology, in evolution of religions, and in many disciplines related to the history of culture. Is it possible to create and sustain global communities through a shared network of images and symbols? And we'll see why we say that at the end. Second question is, in the case of our particular network of paintings from the 16th to 18th century in the Hispanic monarchy territories, what type of religion and what type of art contributed to the very existence of the network? And we will see that at the end of the period we're working on, the content of that network changes dramatically because of historical reasons that we know well. And the third question, is art a candidate for one of the institutions that help sustain large-scale societies and large-scale interactions? So far, Heinrich and his group have been mainly working with 2 institutions as candidates for this kind of bridges for large-scale societies. Market integration and participation in world religions. We are proposing that art or some kind of shared information can also be contributing to that kind of large-scale interactions. So what we have is a manually collected database of Baroque art, Baroque loosely, in loose terms, in which we have in the last 4 years stored over 100,000 topics, around 15,000 artworks, 1,500 creators, 200 schools, a lot of geographical locations, and many atomic descriptions. It has been done by art historians and students, directed by art historians. But we also want, on top of the description that we have in the database of the objects and the artists and all those things, is to store semantic information about our paintings, about the people doing the paintings and all those things. So we added a set of ad hoc descriptors departing from a formal ontology that we created and that we are trying to expand as we are also working with Baroque music, with historical characters from the period, and some other kinds of cultural objects. The ontology we are using here is a subset of that one. For the work, we focus our attention on descriptors and artworks and how they connect. Using descriptors, what we are interested in is giving a similarity measure between artworks, so that we can classify artworks on similarity classes, and also obtain relations for descriptors, and analyze the evolution of these classes and clusters over time. Keep in mind that, as I said, we work with music, we work with people, with the network of Jesuits, for instance, we work with art, we work with books. So what we're trying to determine at the end of the project is how all these different kinds of cultural products relate to each other. Why are they all tagged or labeled under the word Baroque in this period, and how they connect to each other. So what we do in our methodology to establish this similarity measure is for each pair of artworks, we take the common descriptors, the number of common descriptors that we have, and we establish a weighted link between them depending on how many descriptors they share. This methodology has real limitations because our database is still a SQL database, so there are too many joins, and the PC is often crashing because we have too many edges. So what we have done is filter the edges so that we take only works that share at least 6 descriptors or more, and then split the entire dataset into 25-year periods, 12 periods for our case. These are some of the representations of the graphs, and these are the semantic areas of the descriptors that we developed from the former graph representation and data. For the visualization of the raw graphs, what we do is apply some layout algorithms in Getty, Phylogenetic 3D, OpenOR, Ifanhu, and Force Atlas. Then for the analysis of modularity classes, we take only those that are represented as at least 1% of the nodes, and then we apply a filter for the connectivity for those that have a degree range greater than 4, and we finally do the partition and the coloring to get this kind of results in the periods that we are analyzing from 1550 to the end of the Hispanic monarchy as such, with the independencies of the nation states in Latin America, around 1825. For the semantic maps, what we do is calculate the distances between clusters by measuring the frequency of use of descriptors in the artworks as contained in the clusters, and then distribute those supernodes into a 2D space so that the relative positions represent the relative distances between them. The clusters are organized in this space so that we also want to determine the area of influence of each descriptor, so what we call the potential field of the descriptors. And we have to take into account that some descriptors contain others. You have the red one, which is religious painting, And then you have the orange, which is civil, and I call your attention on those two because they sort of evolve over time and change position and importance as we move towards the end of the period. It's also important to note here, because the other graphs, the other visualizations are smaller, the role that portraits will play in the network, and also the importance of the green circle that represents paintings related to Virgin Mary, which is an important issue in religion and culture in Latin America in all these periods. So we take these descriptors because of the questions we are asking to the data: religious, civil, portraits, saints, and Virgin and Christ. As I said, we project similarity classes using an MDS-like algorithm, and for every descriptor we create the potential surface using elements of the distribution as focal points. Then establish a threshold to bound the surface for each descriptor. And this is what we get here. I would like to call your attention, as I said, to the religious descriptor, which is the most important one. This is mainly a religious community, a religious culture, but that's going to be changing. If you see at the beginning of the period, there are not a lot of civil paintings, which are orange, but they keep growing as time passes. The other thing which is very important is that the blue circle is almost non-existent. This is representations of Christ, which you suppose will be very important in a Catholic religion as this Counter-Reformation period. But it's the Virgin that after the third period, when art historians say that the first synthesis of European and local painting start coming out in Mexico mainly, and then in Lima in Peru, it's established, and it's going to stay there for the whole period. Then at the end of the period, you see the importance of the brown descriptor, portraits, which is going to serve sort of a bridge between the religious paintings, the stability of the religious community during the Habsburg period, and then the technical transmission of that semantic content into civil content, as there will be the politicians and the civil Creole elite that will be represented in all those portraits, as opposed to religious portraits that we have had before. A few lines of data decreased in 1725 with the change of the dynasty in Spain, from the Habsburgs to the Bourbons a few years earlier, of religious artworks. The important, in the peak of civil artworks, in the second half of the 18th century. Then in 1775, the production of religious art continues falling down dramatically. And then the importance of portraits, the growth of portraits that follows a parallel path to that of civil paintings from 1725 to the end of our period. I think that the two things that we want to emphasize here is the semantic content that moves from the stability offered by religious descriptors, which cover the whole territory and the whole political community, to the fragmentation that we see in the community through the civil descriptors, because each different community, or what will become a country, will have their own civil leaders, and then they start to not share the information as a whole between the communities in the whole territory. Just very fast, the conclusions. We're following the definitions of Sperber and Hirschfeld about culture as distribution of information in a group, which is something that Boyd and Richardson have done in Not by Genes alone. Culture as information. So what we're going to establish is what kind of information has been shared in a large community like the one we are working on. And the main thing is that this community shares religious information, at least at this level of analysis and with this kind of data. Which type of religion? As I said, a religion which is not Christ-centric, is basically based on Virgin Mary, because it served the synthesis of deities from the pre-Columbian period with the Catholic deity of the Virgin Mary, and also the importance of saints, but only in the first part of the colonization, as the Franciscans, the Dominicans, and all those orders that did the evangelization took their paintings to provide the indigenous people with the right images according to the counter-reformation principles. And finally, the importance of art and the role that it has in evolutionary terms as another way to harness this evolved social psychology of the human being to be able to communicate with the strangers over large-scale societies or over large-scale distances, as is the case of this bicontinental community or culture that was the Hispanic monarchy. For the work, we have just the list there. We have to improve the geolocations. We have almost all geolocations of current geolocations of all the paintings, but the data, the historical data about where they create is not very good. We're improving there and reducing ambiguity. We'll compare modularity classes to places, different by royalties and communities, underline transfers of topics and cultures across space and time, enrich descriptors annotation, so that our historians can go deeper and deeper into the data set and compare more detailed aspects of the set, and mix all this information with the other databases we are creating, on music, people, etc. And then in terms of algorithms, use graph databases instead of relational databases. We are creating the Silva database, a manager for graph databases that can be used almost intuitively by humanists, we hope, and improve the similarity measures, automated tool for semantic maps, and extend semantic maps to evolutionary semantic maps. And this is it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This was really a pleasure. I'm coming out of a world where people do exactly that kind of projects. I was a consultant for 12 years doing that kind of stuff. And there's a lot of lessons which can be taken home. One of the things is these things take long to build. A lot of people are involved. And there's this lesson of the graph database. That's what we said starting in the early 90s. And then I wouldn't do network science if one of my major customers wouldn't have changed to a relational database, and then I decided, no, I don't want to do consulting anymore because it doesn't help. I just want to do research, and I think this is a very, very important thing. Facebook, the largest image database on Earth, runs on a graph database, which says something. And the other thing I want to say, for network scientists in the room and information visualization people in the room, whatever quirks you see in these kinds of projects, you cannot imagine how game-changing that is within art history. When I was in an expert round for 2 weeks in Naples where people were talking about Baroque painting, and in almost every talk, a guy, the Vice King of Naples turned up, which was also called the Duke of Monterey. And after every talk I asked, don't you think it's relevant that the guy actually crossed the Atlantic in a boat and came back to be the Vice King? And of course it's important, and I'm not surprised that this kind of contribution is coming out of the Hispanic humanities world, because they are very, very innovative since a very long time, also in museology and museography. And so this is definitely something we should take care of. And also, not by genes alone, very, very important read, I think, for all of us. Are there any questions? Yeah.
So do we need to wait for the microphone?
If possible, yeah.
It's just a clarification. So.
Okay, just
So if it's just a clarification about the methodology there, because you said that you actually, because of limitations on. So a clarification about the methodology. So because of limitations on your PC, you filtered the network. So you only consider network that has 6 or more attributes in common, right? So you only consider the relation. But then you filter again. Is this what I understood? So you actually double filtering in your network? Mm-hmm. So do you have any idea of the consequence of this, and why not filtering just once in the beginning? Since you cutting the edges that have degree 4 later on, why not just do it in the first stage?
So I guess you're right. I did something like that with an archaeology database where you also filter twice for a certain reason, because if you do community finding, you get a dense network, and then your network of communities dense again. And I think it's definitely worth it to discuss how you filter, when you filter, if thresholding is, actually now we've heard the third talk where people threshold in a simple way, right? And that doesn't work.
So before I do that, my other clarification is just about the semantics there. I didn't understand the graph, perhaps. How is it possible that you have something about the virgin that is not religious? Right, so, I mean, if I look at the graph and the green means summation of Virgin Mary, shouldn't that circle be inside religious always? And I guess is the question.
No. The first thing is that we are not trying to make a partition in the descriptors. So we need the religious one, and then we have some kind of partition inside religions. So virgins, saints, in order to know how is the evolving of the descriptors religious about time. So we have not only virgins inside religion, but sometimes we have that virgins appears in both, in religious and in civil.
To give you an example, you have a St. Mary's column on a square, and you have the picture depicts the square, and you see merchants on the square, and it's not a religious painting, but nevertheless there's a virgin in it. So that's the point.
So that's the reason that we need several.
That's the problem and the quality of the semantic information that we have.
Okay. So I think we're... Oh, there is another question?
The double filtering.
They had to answer the first question.
Yes, the first one, the double filtering. The first